Most stories about the comic book industry are about artists and writers fighting for their creative soul. But the story of Jim Shooter is different. The story about the tension between art and the assembly line. To some, he was the manager who saved Marvel from its own chaos. To others, he was the dictator who broke the spirit of the industry's greatest creator. But you can't understand the iron editor-in-chief of the 1980s without looking at a 13-year-old kid in Pittsburgh in 1965 who was just trying to help his family survive. In the mid-60s, Jim Shooter wasn't living a glamorous life. His father was a steelworker in a city defined by grit and hard labor, and the family was struggling. For Jim, comic books weren't just a hobby or a gateway to a fantasy world. They were a potential paycheck. He looked at the Legion of Superheroes books being put out by DC at the time, and with the confidence only a teenager can have, decided he could do a better job than the professionals. He sat down, wrote 3 full scripts with layouts, and mailed them to Mort Weisinger at DC Comics. Now, you have to understand who Mort Weisinger is to understand the true DNA of Jim Shooter's career. Weisinger was the editor-in-chief of the Superman line, and he was infamous for being a tyrant. He didn't care about creative expression or the feelings of his staff. He cared about the product. He ran his office like a boot camp, demanding absolute clarity and rigid adherence to his rules. If a story was confusing or if a writer tried to get too artsy, Mort would tear them apart. He was a man who believed the editor was the undisputed king of the narrative. Surprisingly, Mort didn't just buy Jim's scripts. He fast-tracked the 14-year-old into the professional rank. By the time Jim was in 9th grade, he was a lead writer for the Legion of Superheroes. While his classmates were playing sports or going to dances, Jim was responsible for the flagship teen hero team of the world's biggest publisher. He was the mind behind the Fatal 5, Karate Kid, Princess Project Terra, and Shadowlass. Most notably, he wrote The Death of Pharaoh Lad, a moment that shocked the industry because at DC in the 60s, major heroes simply didn't die. This is the Weisinger school of thought. He learned that a comic book is a machine with moving parts, and if one part, like a late artist or a confusing plot, wasn't working, the whole machine failed. He saw the rules as the only thing standing between success and his family going hungry. He balanced this high pressure of professional life with high school, learning that professionalism meant hitting every deadline and following every editorial mandate without question. To Jim, a creator who wanted to break the rules wasn't a visionary, they were an amateur who was risking the company's stability. This perspective is the key to his entire legacy. He didn't walk into Marvel in 1978 wanting to be a villain. He walked in as the graduate of the hardest, most disciplined school in comics. He wasn't just an editor, he was the product of the industry's harshest era, and he was about to bring that steel mill work ethic to a company that was used to being a clubhouse. To understand why Jim Shooter's rise to power was so dramatic, you have to understand that in 1977, Marvel Comics was in a failing state. Today we see Marvel as this multi-billion-dollar cinematic empire, but in the late 70s, it was a chaotic, disorganized office in New York. Stan Lee had moved to Los Angeles to try and get movies made, and back at the House of Ideas, the door was revolving. In the span of 6 years, Marvel went through 8 different editors-in-chief. It was the clubhouse atmosphere where legendary creators did whatever they wanted. Deadlines were treated as more suggestions, and the books were becoming a mess of internal continuity that no new reader could understand. Jim Shooter walked into this mess when he was only 27 years old. But remember, he already had 13 years of professional experience. He was a veteran who had been raised in the Weisinger School of Discipline, and what he saw at Marvel horrified him. He saw a company where the dreaded deadline doom wasn't just a funny catchphrase in the letters page, it was a literal financial crisis. When a book was late, Marvel had to run reprints, which killed sales and pissed off newsstand vendors. Jim didn't see creative freedom. He saw a lack of professionalism that was going to put everyone out of a job. When he was appointed as the 9th editor-in-chief in 1978, he didn't just take the job, he took command. He realized that for Marvel to survive, it had to stop being a clubhouse and start being a corporation. He instituted what became known as the Shooter Mandate. And this is where the polarization really begins. He demanded that every single book come out on time. Every single month, no exceptions. He created a tracking system to ensure scripts and art were moving through the office like an assembly. For the first time in years, the trains at Marvel were running on schedule. But he didn't stop the schedule, he went after the stories themselves. Drawing from his DC roots, Jim believed in the rules of clear storytelling. He famously mandated that every comic had to be a jumping on point. If Spider-Man appeared on page 1, there has to be a caption explaining who he was and how he got his powers. He hated decompressed storytelling, where nothing happens for issues at a time. He wanted value for money. He would personally sit down with legends like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and tell them that their layouts were confusing or their pacing was off. Imagine being a 20-something editor telling guys who invented the medium that they were doing it wrong. That took a level of confidence, or maybe arrogance, that the industry had never seen. Ironically, while he was becoming a dictator in the writer's room, he was a hero in the accounting office. Jim was the one who fought for creator royalties and for the return of original artwork to artists. He wanted a professional industry where creators got paid for their success. But in exchange, he demanded total editorial control. He was offering a trade. I will make you rich and famous, but you have to play by my rules. This era saw the birth of some of the greatest runs in Marvel history. Claremont's X-Men, Miller's Daredevil, and Byrne's Fantastic Four all happened under Shooter's watch. He provided a structure that allowed these masterpieces to exist. But he also held the leash. The tragedy of this period is that the same discipline that saved Marvel from bankruptcy started to feel like a cage for the people who worked there. Jim wasn't just fixing a company, he was rebuilding it in his own image, tall, rigid, and absolutely uncompromising. He had successfully saved the House of Ideas, but in the process he was turning it into a House of Jim, and the creative friction was starting to reach a boiling. By the early 1980s, Jim Shooter wasn't satisfied with just being a manager. He wanted to revolutionize how comics were sold, and in doing so, he accidentally invented the modern crossover event that still dominates the industry today. To understand this, you have to look at Marvel's superhero Secret Wars. On paper, it was a corporate mandate. Mattel wanted a toy line and they needed a comic to sell it. Shooter didn't just edit Secret Wars, he wrote it. He took all the major pieces of the Marvel Universe, the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and their greatest villains, and threw them onto a battle world. To the critics and some of the more high art creators at Marvel, this was a crass commercial gimmick. But to the kids on the newsstands, it was the greatest thing they had ever seen. Shooter applied his Weisinger School logic to the biggest stage possible. The stakes were absolute, the powers were clearly defined, and every issue ended on a cliffhanger that demanded you buy the next one. Secret Wars was a massive, unprecedented success. It proved Shooter's thesis that if you provided a clear, high-stakes narrative with iconic characters, the audience would show up in droves. It was the birth of the event comic, but it also marked a turning point in his relationship with the staff. By writing the company's biggest book himself, Shooter was also sending a message. I am the lead creator here. He wasn't just the referee anymore. He was a star player, the coach, and the owner of the team. This led to the creation of the new universe in 1986, which was supposed to be Shooter's crowning achievement. The idea was to celebrate Marvel's 25th anniversary by launching a brand new line of comics that lived in the real world, with no magic, no aliens, and no gods. Just humans dealing with strange new powers. It was Shooter's attempt to prove that his rules of storytelling were so powerful they didn't even need Spider-Man or Captain America to work. He wanted a universe where time moved in real time and actions had permanent consequences. However, the new universe became the first major crack in the Iron Editor-in-Chief armor. The project was plagued by budget cuts from the parent company, and many of the top-tier creators at Marvel refused to work on it because they were already fed up with Shooter's management style. Jim ended up writing many of the lead titles himself, stretching himself too thin. While books like Starbrand had interesting ideas, the line was largely seen as a failure. For the first time, the Shooter machine had stalled. During this same period, the friction with the A-list creators reached a fever pitch. This was the area of the Great Exodus. John Byrne, who had been a pillar of the Shooter era with Fantastic Four, left for DC to reboot Superman. Frank Miller left. Steve Englehart left. These weren't just freelancers, these were the architects of Marvel's success. They were tired of having their scripts rewritten to fit the rules. They were tired of Shooter's my way or the highway editorial style. Jim saw himself as the protector of the characters, ensuring that Captain America always liked Captain America. But the creators sometimes saw him as a wall standing between them and their art. He was the man who had given them royalties and returned their artwork, but he was also the man who wouldn't let them breathe. By 1986, Shooter was the height of his commercial power, but he was becoming an island. He had built a corporate masterpiece, but he had alienated the clubhouse that made Marvel special in the first. The stage was set for the rebellion, and the very professionalism Jim had fought so hard to instill was about to be used against him. By 1987, the Shooter Doctrine had become a source of systematic friction that was grinding Marvel's gears to a halt. To understand how the most powerful man in comics got outed, you had to look past the mean boss narrative and look at the actual power structure. Jim had spent years consolidating power, but in doing so, he had created a bottleneck. He was the only one who could make a final decision, which meant that as Marvel grew, he became a roadblock to the very professionalism he preached. While the creative friction was the public story, there was a deeper financial layer to the firing. According to Shooter's own accounts and later research, he had discovered that Marvel's parent company, New World Pictures, was failing to pay creators foreign royalties. Jim, who had fought for creators' rights early in his career, reportedly cornered the CFO and threatened a class action lawsuit on behalf of the freelancers. He rolled the dice, hoping his value as the man who saved the company would protect him. Unfortunately, it didn't. To the corporate board, he wasn't just a difficult manager anymore, he was now a legal liability. The Champagne Rebellion, as it's known now, wasn't confined to the office. The most famous, and arguably most brutal moment of this period, took place at the home of legendary artist John Byrne. Byrne had once been a close collaborator of Shooter's. Byrne hosted a party for Marvel staffers and freelancers who became a piece of industry legend. In Byrne's backyard, the guests didn't just celebrate, they burned Jim Shooter in effigy. They constructed a life-size figure of their former boss, stuffed the coat pockets with unsold copies of his New Universe comics, the project he had staked his reputation on, and set it on fire. This wasn't just a party, ritualistic projection of his 10-year reign. It highlighted a level of personal animosity that is almost unheard of in personal creative fields. The rebellion even bled onto the page. Shortly after the firing, John Byrne took over the writing duties for Starbrand, which had been Shooter's flagship New Universe title. In an act of pure narrative pettiness, Byrne wrote a storyline where the protagonist accidentally triggers an explosion that completely destroys the city of Pittsburgh, Jim Shooter's hometown. To the readers, it was a high-stakes plot twist. To the industry insiders, it was a public, permanent middle finger to the man who had tried to build a universe in his own image. This scorched earth approach by the creators showed that they didn't just want him gone, they wanted to dismantle everything he had built. Jim walked out with his rulebook, and the clubhouse was back. But as the champagne was flowing, no one realized they were also celebrating the end of the most stable, profitable era Marvel would ever know until the modern MCU era. Without Jim's iron fist to enforce clarity and discipline, the company began to drift into the style over substance era of the 90s. The rebellion saved the spirit of the creators, but it removed the only man who knew how to say no to the excesses that would eventually lead Marvel to the brink of bankruptcy a decade later. When Jim Shooter was fired from Marvel in 1987, the industry largely viewed him as a burned-out dictator. He spent a short period in what many called his wilderness years, but Jim was never a man to stay idle. In 1989, he partnered with Stephen Masarki to form Voyager Communications. The goal was simple but audacious: to create a third pillar in the comic book industry that could stand toe-to-toe with the giants. This gave birth to Valiant Comics, and it remains one of the most successful indie launches in the history of the medium. Shooter's strategy for Valiant was a masterclass in intellectual property management. Instead of trying to create entirely new characters from scratch, which is notoriously difficult in a market dominated by nostalgia, he went to Western Publishing and licensed the Gold Key characters: Magnus Robot Fighter, Solar Man of the Atom, and Turok Dinosaur Hunter. These were characters with history, but no modern baggage. Jim applied the West Singer School logic to these properties with a level of intensity that even his Marvel years hadn't seen. He didn't just write them, he created a total narrative environment. At Valiant, the Shooter Doctrine reached its final form. He instituted a time and space log, a literal master ledger that tracked exactly where every character was at any given minute across the entire line. If a character was injured in Solar number 1 on a Tuesday, they were still wearing the bandage in Magnus number 3 published that same month. In 1992, Jim launched Unity, a crossover event that many historians consider the perfect version of the genre he had invented with Secret. Unlike Marvel or DC crossovers, which often felt like disjointed cash grabs, Unity was a seamless 18-part epic where every chapter mattered. It was a mathematical marvel of storytelling. The success was staggering. Collectors who were tired of the style over substance of the Image Comics era, which prioritized flashy art over coherent plots, flocked to Valiant for its legendary consistency. For a brief window, Valiant was the third largest publisher in the world. Jim had officially proven his thesis. The rules had worked. He didn't need Peter Parker or Steve Rogers, he just needed discipline and a clear vision. But the pattern of Jim's life was destined to repeat. As Valiant's valuation skyrocketed, Jim clashed with his financial backers at Triumph Capital. The investors saw the 1990s speculator bubble, the era of holographic covers and foil stamp number 1 issues, as a way to make a quick fortune. Jim, ever the purist, saw it as a cancer that would eventually kill the industry. He refused to compromise the integrity of his stories for short-term sales gimmicks. In late 1992, in a move that mirrored the Champagne Rebellion at Marvel, the board ousted Jim from the company he had built. He was once again a man without a kingdom, watching from the sidelines as the investors eventually sold Valiant to video game giant Acclaim Entertainment for $65 million, a fortune built entirely out of the foundation Jim had laid. Undeterred, Jim immediately launched Defiant Comics. Marvel, perhaps seeking professional revenge, sued Defiant over the title Plasm, claiming it was too similar to their character Marvel UK's Plasmer. The legal battle cost Defiant $300,000 in fees before they even printed a single book, effectively bleeding the company dry. Tried one last time in 1995 with Broadway Comics, a partnership with Broadway Video. He was still pushing his writer-centric philosophy with titles like Starseed and Fatale, but the industry was in a free fall. The speculator bubble Jim had predicted was finally bursting, and the era of the super editor was over. Broadway folded when its parent company was sold, leaving Jim as a legend of a bygone era. The 2000s saw a strange, quiet homecoming. The industry that had celebrated his firing now looked at his era with a sense of nostalgic respect. He returned to DC Comics in 2008 to write The Legion of Superheroes once again. It was a poetic closing of the circle. He spent his final decades as a mentor, running a blog where he meticulously recounted the industry's history from his perspective, never wavering in his belief that comic book was a craft that demanded absolute, uncompromising discipline. To truly assess the impact of Jim Shooter, we have to move past the gossip, the office parties, and the villain persona to ask one fundamental question. What is the net result of the Shooter year? In any academic study of an industry, you look for lasting structural change. But when we apply that lens to Jim, we see that the modern, multi-billion-dollar superhero machine is partially on the foundation he laid, whether the people running it today like to admit it or not. It is easy to paint Jim Shooter as the antagonist of 1980s comics, but a fair assessment requires us to look at the Shooter reforms, the structural changes he made that actually empowered creators. Before Shooter, if a book sold 1 million copies, the writer and the artist got their flat page rate and nothing else. Jim fought the corporate board to institute a royalty system so that the people making the art shared in the success of the product. This shifted creators from being factory labor to being the true stakeholders in their own creations. He ended the Clubhouse era, where the books were routinely late. By demanding that the trains run on time, he ensured that the freelance creators had a steady, predictable income and that the industry stayed viable in the eyes of newsstand distributors who were otherwise ready to drop comics entirely. Jim even formalized the process of returning physical art to the artists, allowing legends like Jack Kirby to finally own and profit from the sale of the original masterpieces. If you look at the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe, you are looking at the ultimate evolution of the Shooter Doctrine. The concept of a tightly controlled, logically consistent shared universe where every story flows into the next and every character remains on model is exactly what Jim was trying to achieve. He was one of the people who taught the industry how to be a professional brand rather than just a loose collection of independent visions. He was a man born of the Pittsburgh steel mills and raised in the harsh West Singer School of the 1960s. He believed that a comic book was a service to the reader, and that the service required a strong central authority to ensure quality and clarity. He was often a villain to the creators who wanted total freedom, but he was a hero to the business that needed to survive. Ultimately, Jim Shooter remains polarizing because he represents a fundamental truth that the art world often hates to acknowledge. Sometimes the machine needs a mechanic more than it needs a poet. He was the man who saved Marvel so it could live long enough to be bought by Disney. He was the man who built Valiant from the ashes of forgotten history. He was a writer, an editor, a publisher, and a lightning rod for controversy. Jim Shooter passed away on June 30th, 2025, at the age of 73. But his shadow over the industry has never been longer. He was a man who never stopped believing that a story should make sense and that a professional should hit their deadline. In a world defined by imagination and chaos, he was the man who brought the rules. And whether you loved him or hated him, the professionalized, interconnected industry we have today is the one that Jim Shooter helped build. This brings our journey through the Shooter era to a close. Whether you see him as the architect who saved the industry or the editor-in-chief with the iron fist who broke its spirit, there's no denying that the modern, professionalized world of superhero storytelling wouldn't exist without the foundations he laid. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Marvel's most transformative eras, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more journeys through comic book history. If you want to go one step further, you can become a channel member down the link in the description. Your support is what allows me to spend the dozens of hours required for digital research, digging through decades of issues, to bring you the full story on everything we cover on Tales from the Longbox. Members help keep the production going, and as a thank you, you'll even get your name featured in the credits of a future video. And more importantly, what should we cover next? Another forgotten D-lister? A bizarre storyline from the back issue bins? Or maybe one of the stranger teams publishers have come up with over the years? Let me know down in the comments. I always enjoy reading your comments and seeing what deep cuts you all remember. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.